All right, we're on the air. Hello, everyone. 1 second. I'm just going to check my own Twitter feed to see if it automatically tweeted to let people know. Here's the thing. I'm constantly learning. And yeah, right now, it did. It worked. Good. And one of the things I'm trying to do now is to do these live, even if they're at weird hours and times, so that if people have questions, they can drop them down in the chat and I'll watch the chat. And if I see a question I like, I will ask our guest. Our guest is invited to watch the chat as well. But if we're both sitting here watching the chat, it's probably not that interesting. My guest tonight is Adam Blinkensop.
Better than most.
Oh, okay. Well, better
solid.
I didn't nail it. And Adam will be teaching me, your host, Eppy, about Wargames. Adam, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, gosh. I have been playing Wargames for a very, 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 very long time because it's just got so many of the things that I'm very interested in. History that I wasn't interested in until the Wargames kind of brought that out.
That's the best thing about hobbies.
Right? The narrative nature of them, because I love to play role-playing games as well. And it was harder to find a role-playing game group than it was to find somebody to play a war game with when I was a kid.
That is interesting. Yeah.
Much, very weird. But yeah, so I do all of that stuff. I'm also kind of a musician and a programmer, and I just do lots of little weird things. So all of today is kind of amateur wargaming historian stuff. Definitely not my full-time thing. So if anybody in chat notices that I make huge mistakes, please let me know because I'm interested.
I'm all about the mistakes. That's why we're here. Yeah, actually, so I know. I think you. I associate you. Like I'm trying to figure out. I associate you with the Another Question podcast too, which I know is on hiatus. I'm going to say hiatus. I'm hoping it's hiatus.
Hiatus is our intention, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Which is a lovely podcast and one that I really enjoy. It's about games and game design, and it's one that when I'm walking on my daily commute, I often find myself saying things out loud to it. So
that's our hope. Like
that's
the Another Question podcast for us. This is Sage Latora and my. We wanted an excuse to talk about games for an hour every couple of weeks, and we figured if we recorded it, maybe somebody would be interested. And all of them are online at anotherquestion.com. I think if Sage is still awesome and stuff. We've been meaning to do. We have an idea for the next season. That's a really good one because it's Sage's idea. So as soon as he has a few moments to spare every few weeks, we will probably get that going again.
Excellent. So let me tell you a little bit about my wargaming history because I'll let you know where your student sits.
Sounds good.
I have read the
Playing at the World.
Well, I was going to say fantasy wargaming. The highest level of them all. But I've not played that one. I've only read that one. That's a fun book to read if it's filled with anyways, it's enjoyable. I have played some Space 1889 related ones. There's like Ironclads or I know I played Sky Galleons, which is more of a board gamey one. Are you know of which I speak here? Yeah.
I haven't played it, but I know of it.
Yeah, we used to play those back in the day. That was a one that I tried to at some point in my youth, that was like a thing that I really wanted to make happen with my friends. So, and I had friends that I could force into playing.
If you're the one that has the stuff.
Yeah. Exactly. And then I have read Osprey's I don't remember what they call them, but they're the two books. One's for ancient warfare and one's for medieval warfare.
Mm-hmm.
Like a accompaniment, and then of course, like any good nerd, I have a smattering of Osprey books just lying about based on the cover, right?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. You pick them up, read a couple pages, go maybe another time, and then absolutely.
Yeah. But aside from that, like most of my like Ogre, Car Wars, like those kinds of I don't are they I mean, are they considered war games? Or are they considered blasphemy?
So the heresy that we are going to be discussing today, I'm going to try as hard as I can to avoid definitional argument because it's just not interesting. But most of what I'm going to be talking about is historical conflict simulations.
Okay.
So
excellent.
Ogre, certainly a conflict simulation.
Yeah.
Not very historical. But there are also historical conflict games that aren't very much simulations. And there are historical simulations that don't really talk about conflict so much. But if you go anywhere into the wargaming community, the grognard community, which is, the grumblers, right?
Yeah.
You will find somebody to disagree with you on any definitional thing.
And so these are like one layer removed from legit grognards, right? Because legit grognards are some sort of French troop.
Yes.
Right?
So
and so the next layer are the wargamers that know that. And then the next layer are the role players who really like old role-playing games.
Yeah. It's been co-opted. I believe it was first co-opted by the wargamers, and then the use kind of switched. Napoleonic era, this is 1800, 1815, that area. He had people in his guard that had been there for, a decade by the end, 15 years. And the longer you survived Napoleon's army, the more respect you were given because, just the way things worked. And so they were titled the grognards, the grumblers, people that had been there forever. They know everything. But they have their own opinions about everything.
Yeah.
And so wargamers will tend to call themselves that just because it's fun to associate.
It's a beautiful term. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, it's great. Okay. So what we've learned so far is that what you're about to teach me, I've had no experience with whatsoever.
That's right.
Except for reading those Osprey books, I guess.
Yeah. And the idea behind games like Ogre, games like Car Wars, those kind of emerged from the echoes of wargaming in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Like modern wargame is really an artifact of Avalon Hill in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, making these games one or two a year that were find a really interesting subject, find a cool designer to work on it, pump that game out. And they didn't think that the hobby could even sustain more than one or two games a year. They thought, this is a small thing. It's a weird esoteric topic. Who's going to be able to even deal with this? So in that period, there was fanzines that started up. In particular, like SPI came out of the Strategy and Tactics fanzine. And SPI said, we could probably print a whole bunch of these. So they just started putting games in their magazines, which is continuing to happen. And started their own company, and SPI and Avalon Hill were just selling huge amounts of product in the 70s, which is kind of the golden age of modern wargaming. And then they both tanked. And there's quite a bit of thoughts as to why that might have been.
Right.
But kind of out of the ashes of that, like TSR bought SPI and then just liquidated it basically, and Hasbro bought Avalon Hill and kept the good stuff. But kind of what we're dealing with today are a lot of the games that I'm going to talk about are games that came out of the people that played those when they were kids and then grew up, and they're making games based on their nostalgic memory of that. Like we play modern role-playing games that aren't really D&D anymore,
Right.
but they're based on your memory of D&D most of the time. The nostalgic type of thing, right?
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to tell a little tale about wargaming experience with wargaming here, if I may. The several years ago, I'm going to say like 6 or 7 years ago, I was at a convention. It was a college convention. So, but it was it was one of these small local conventions that drew from various nerd communities. So you would have like people who were interested in like Society for Creative Anarchism. You would have people who were interested in anime. You would have people who are interested in role-playing games, and you have people who are interested in war games. And for some reason, they all thought they could hang out together like that.
Hey, yeah, if you've got a small community, you want to band together.
Yeah. So at this convention, we basically were running a small role-playing convention inside this convention. Absolutely. And we discovered that there was also a war game going on. It was, I believe, a Napoleonic one. We got there early in the morning to enjoy the breakfast buffet and the coffee, and we went over to check out the war game room, and they had this like enormous setup with green
several tables and just covered in. Yeah,
this is like it's like 4 or 5 tables long, and just it's gorgeous, and they have these lovely miniatures that are not like the minis we're used to in role-playing games where you had like several soldiers to a base, right? Like, and I'm almost certain it was a Napoleonic one.
It's there's go ahead.
Yeah, so they're set up on either side of this, and they were these were older gentlemen who were so excited to meet people. They were so excited to see people who were like at all interested, because we were interested. We were definitely interested. So we asked them about it. What's going on? What are they going to be doing? And they're like, "Do you want to play? Do you want to play?" And we're like, "Well, no, we have to run our own games." So we went, and I read a bunch of like Swords Without Master and things like that. And it was, there wasn't a whole lot of people there, so you just kind of like played a few games and then sat there and shot the shit because you
totally.
Right. Around lunch, we went over to check on no, they came in to our room near lunch or whatever, and we asked them how they were doing, and they're like, "Oh, it's so great. We've almost made contact."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That
the whole morning, I played like 3 games, and they had not yet reached. And there's a deep, deep part of me that was jealous of their morning of marching across this gorgeous mini. So, okay, I'm sorry. I just had to tell that little tale there because I think that there's something about that in games that draws me, and I can't. I have trouble justifying it with my own mortality.
Absolutely. There are games in my collection that would take months to play.
Yes.
But I don't own those games to play them.
Right.
Which is kind of in the role-playing game hobby, you can at least understand that because you've got books I'm sure that you haven't played. In the wargaming hobby, it's really common because the books are so interesting because they're just packed full of historical information. Because all of the games that I have on my shelf are some designer's thesis statement about what happened and why it happened.
Yes.
Right? and just going over somebody's ideas about that. And for example, I have several games on the same topic. Why do they deal with them differently?
Yeah.
This person says, "Oh, I don't think that the battle was as bloody as everybody else thought," or this person says, "Oh yeah, there's no way they would have actually stayed in combat this long because of this reason and this reason." And you play them and it feels differently and all this kind of stuff. The 3 books that I put on Twitter this morning about the kind of the things I wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah.
One of them, so the Playing at the World is kind of this history of war games and role playing games. But one of them is Simulating War, which is talking about how do you even go about designing these things. And his whole thing is that he teaches a class on war game design at King's College, Philip Sabin. And his entire point is you don't have to have a 2-week-long game to really simulate the thing that you want to simulate. You just boil it way down.
Yeah.
And he makes games that you can play in 15 minutes at a war college, because you have to.
Yeah.
You just have to keep abstracting. So, but what they were probably playing, to be historical and stuff, they were probably playing a Kriegspiel. Do you know about Kriegspiel?
So tell me about. So I did listen to your podcast episode about this, yes. But I think this is one of the few times where we break kayfabe and we don't pretend that you're teaching me, and we just tell the whole audience about the Kriegspiel.
Well, I'm going to teach you a few things too, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm going to learn along the way.
Well, for Kriegspiel specifically, Kriegspiel is the Prussians got really upset that Napoleon destroyed them in the wars and decided that they weren't going to let that happen. And the best way to train is to do. And since you can't really do in war very often, you play. And kind of the descendants of these old war games that you would play in a room with a moderator, telling the moderator what you do, and the moderator tells you what happened, is our modern role-playing game.
Ah, yeah, absolutely.
And the modern role-playing game with you're going to roll these dice to come up with what happens and compare it to this target number and what's your armor class, those fed back into the modern war game. There's a game called Squad Leader that came out in the 70s that sold 200,000 copies, like probably the best-selling war game historical conflict sim ever made. And it's a roll 2d6 game. Yeah. It's very comparable to something like, because the whole point of the game is planning out what you're going to do and moving around and solving that, kind of puzzle about what this conflict is actually looking like on the table.
Cool.
But the modern games, because that's, if you want to actually play something, you're probably not going to go play Squad Leader, or ASL is you can still get Squad Leader effectively, because there's a company called MMP that was made by a bunch of playtesters of Avalon Hill that loved games so much. And they said, can we get anything from Hasbro? And Hasbro's like, we're never going to sell any of these things. So go ahead, do whatever. And so they bought Advanced Squad Leader, and they're still selling it.
Oh, nice.
It still exists as a game. It's, forever old. You can buy a huge folio full of rule books. It's bigger than the D&D manuals. Like, it's a monster. And there are huge numbers of fans about Advanced Squad Leader. And there are tournaments that you can go play in. And it only takes half an hour to play.
Oh, okay. You
put your tokens on the map. You move your tokens around. You roll your dice. And the combat's over.
Well, that's sad.
Yeah, it's... You are not the only person with limited time, I guess. Yeah. And one of the big things that happens is that you go to a convention, and the convention is there because somebody wanted to play a game for 3 days. One of the wargaming conventions that I go to that's local started because the people that started it wanted to play their, we have to play it for 5 days straight to finish it. And, I can't take the kitchen table for that long. But if I get a hotel...
Yes.
And that's grown to be, I think it's like 150 people now. And one of the big rooms is they're going to play the same game the whole weekend. And they'll play, they'll land on the beaches at Normandy, and they'll do that the whole weekend. Or there are people that play Twilight Imperium, which is a light game for us war gamers because it only takes about 5 hours to play. There's all this kind of stuff
but
that you
not
can end up doing.
Historical simulation.
Right. Not historical. And I wouldn't even, it's hard to be simulation if you're not historical anymore.
Right.
So games that I have that I really want to talk about.
Yeah,
that's really why I contacted you, is because I just want to talk about my favorite games for a little while.
that's perfect. That's what I want out of people.
So give me a moment, and I will accumulate a few.
Oh, great. Excellent. Well, I will talk to chat while this is happening so that we have some pretty good radio here. I see that Emily Care Boss is in chat and has sent us emojis of a guardsman in a tree. Oh, right, because Emily was there for the whole deal with the Napoleonic War. People at that convention. And then Generic Nerd. Hello.
Exciting times.
I decided to talk with chat a little bit. I think we have just saying hello to the two people that are in there while you went to get your.
We'll take a couple people.
Yeah, that's good.
So there's squad leader.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for good war games, the 4 big periods that people are very interested in and thus have a million games about them, you have World War II. You have World War II. You have Napoleonics. Everything about that era, right? You have the American Civil War, and you have Ancients.
And right.
And so, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, like, is there the Napoleonics? Is that important because that's sort of where all of this begins?
I think that's one of it. One of the other things is that Napoleon was such a genius.
Okay.
That the change in how war was fought up to the Napoleonic era and then past the Napoleonic era, there's such a huge transition point. And for whatever reason, he was the first person to really understand that transition point.
Right.
So all the battles tend to be really interesting ones to look at and talk about. I'm a Napoleonic nerd myself. This is a book entirely about the campaigns of Napoleon and just all of them. And I've got one about every single battle that was fought during the French Revolution up to Waterloo, and a couple of aftermath battles, just because, well, I'm designing that game.
So. Good. I was looking over to see if I can reach at close reach because I'm the ancient warfare. That's the stuff that most recently has sit in my brain with like books on Hannibal and Rome and whatnot.
And let me talk about great battles of history then.
Yeah, well, follow your heart.
Yeah. So war games work in series. So you have D&D, which has a series of games, and they're changing, but they're basically about the same subject.
Right.
In war games, you'll have somebody make a first game, and then the system works for that game. So then they'll make another game about a slightly different battle, a slightly different topic, but where the system they feel still works. And so there's a series that a couple of very good designers have been making called Great Battles of History that's about ancient warfare.
Okay.
And the huge thesis in this entire series is that when these huge groups of people ran into fight, it wasn't one side didn't lose because they were all killed. One side lost because they lost all their cohesion and they started just running as fast as they possibly could. And while they were running, I mean, maybe you can kill some of them on the way out, but that wasn't the point. Like, the point was to get them to rout. And the entire system is based on that idea about just loading these cohesion hits on top of your opponent's units.
I will say that that stuff is fantastically interesting to me, even in a role-playing context, when you have a system that will output something other than the loss of hit points and who dies at the end, right? Like, I when it's like, oh no, you've swung a sharp metal thing at me, I have decided to go home. Mm-hmm. That is a really interesting outcome. That I think So yeah, I that's the kind of stuff that I really kind of dig and get into there, because it is different, and it makes, it makes for interesting things down the line too. Like, well, you've seen this person before and whatnot. But
Oh
I'm sorry,
yeah.
I don't want to hijack. I'm
No,
sorry, I apologize.
the back and forth is important to me.
Yeah,
The game that I have that's probably if you were going to pick up a game
yeah,
on Great Battles of History, you would pick up a game called Hoplite, which GMT recently reprinted. And I think it has 10, 11, 12 battles in it, from Marathon to Platea to, all of the famous stuff. And then a
yeah.
couple of really simple ones that are historically driven. And it tells you, here are the Phoenicians on this side, and here are the Greeks on this side, and here are the whatever. And the one that you start with, you line up all your hoplites on one side, and you line up all of your opponent's units on the other side. And the hoplites, they would sing songs to keep timing, and so they can actually continue at an even rate.
Oh, wow.
But if
Yeah.
anybody else wants to, but as soon as they're getting attacked, they break into a run because it's just hard. Yeah. And the game, as a simulation theory, says, well, you can't control their running speed. So you roll to determine how fast the different groups are running. And while you're playing this game, you have this wave of units that's slightly moving apart from each other.
Yeah.
And they slam into the opponent's front, which is scarier sitting on the other side than any role-playing game I've ever played. Because it's coming. There's not much you can do about it.
Yeah.
You're not sure how well they're going to roll when they hit you. Because they're running, they get a bonus when they slam into you. So you want to start running yourself, but if you start running, then you're going to be slightly out of order as well. So you're not going to be able to support yourself when that eventual hit happens. But that first game of Hoplite is maybe an hour. It's got like 10 pieces on each side. You roll D10s and put couple shits down. And if that's too long, there's a simple Great Battles of History, which is just kind of a variant. It's just, here's a bunch of simpler rules, and you can replace the actual game rules with these to even remove more of the boilerplate, remove more of the tokens that you place down. And then it's like 15 minutes, 20 minutes to play.
And then
marathon. They're not all 3 day long.
Yeah.
I do have a couple that are what is it? Destination games, maybe.
Okay.
In particular, this is probably my favorite game of all time. It has the weirdest pitch. This is Here I Stand.
Okay.
And you've heard about this on stream, because it's one of Sage's favorite games too. Here I Stand is a 6-player, 6 to 8 hour game about the Reformation.
Yes.
Which is just the craziest thing to try to pitch to somebody. You have the Pope and Martin Luther butting heads in kind of the Catholic and the Protestant wars. You have the French and the English who have never liked each other. You have the Ottomans approaching from the east. You have the Spanish, which is the Habsburgs at the time. Slowly, their empire is disintegrating in front of this stuff. And what the designer realized, because this is a period that he was very interested in, from another game that's 40 years old, called A Mighty Fortress. And if you catch that reference, good for you. All of these interesting things were happening in the same time period. This is 1517-ish. That's Gutenberg. That's Luther and 95 Theses. That's exploring the New World. That's, all of this stuff all in this same time. How about you just make a game that does all of the cool stuff that was happening in Europe at that time? So, but this game is what's called a card-driven game. And wargamers use card-driven game a very particular way.
Okay.
Which is why I bring it up. There's a ton of games that do this. And so if you've learned the system, you're pretty good for easily 50, 60 games. And you'll sit down and you'll pick it up and you'll say, oh, I know exactly how to play this, because they all play basically the same. They all have a card, and the card has a number on it, and the card has text on it. And when you play your card, you do the number of action points, or you do the text that's written on the card. And then I'll play my card, and you'll play your card, and Sage will play his card, and we just go.
And so, like, that's a card that you just draw off a deck, or is that like you have a hand of cards that you
have a hand of cards? So the person that came up with the idea for card-driven games is Mark Herman, kind of a Vincent Baker figure of wargaming, I guess. And his thought was, we had been playing these chess-style games for so long, but in a real war, you don't know what my moves are. You don't know what I could do. You don't know how well I could do it. And so this kind of, I'm going to go and then you're going to go, and I know exactly what your options are. It didn't feel real to him. And so he said, well, how can I limit your options and also make it so that you and I don't know what each other can do? And change kind of how we would evaluate how well things could possibly go.
Right.
And again, back to Napoleonic era, there's a book called On War by Clausewitz, who traveled with Napoleon, or traveled with the other side, I think, for a long time. And his big thing is that he said war is most like a game of cards, because you can hide your position, you can hide your material, you can hide your units, and then only when everything hits the table do you know who's won and who's lost. And you can say, I'm not feeling very good about this whole thing, and you can leave, but you'll never get to see how it would have turned out. And so Mark Herman took all of those ideas and said, let's just bake all that into cards. And like everything in wargaming, there's huge debate over whether this is a good thing or a bad thing.
Because, anytime something catches on, it's no.
There are people that are like, these aren't war games, they're not conflict simulations, they're not historical, because I get to choose when this historical event happened, and there's no way I would have actually gotten to choose that.
Right.
And so at some point you have to decide if you can deal with it or not.
I think I can deal, but I understand.
So that's Here I Stand, and the rest of the game you would recognize. There's a dice pool for combat, and you just, how many troops do I have? That's how many dice I roll. 5s and 6s are hits, and then go. There's a Blades in the Dark mechanic for the religious war. Who rolls the higher die in this kind of fight, and that's the person that ends up winning over there. Just all of this kind of little pieces that would look very recognizable coming from a role-playing game. Now, it is 6 to 8 hours. But it's, once you start a game like that, like you were mentioning at the convention, by the end, so much has happened. It's like you start playing a role-playing game and you play it for 4 hours and it feels like it's just immediate.
Right.
Time is just gone. So, but sometimes that's hard to do. So card-driven games. Go ahead.
It's more of a scheduling problem than the will. And
definitely. And so they tend to be convention games. And that's hard because you're playing with people that you might not know. And a big long game is always hard when you don't know people. And war games, because you're driven directly into conflict, unlike role-playing games where everybody's is trying to get along and you're all on the same team at the start. You're playing Here I Stand. I am trying to stab you in the face. We're not. So
good.
So that can be hard.
Put people in a room and make them hate each other.
Yeah. Well, so diplomacy, right, is the classic 50s war game. And Here I Stand avoids the diplomacy problem because everybody has a friend. England and the Protestants are kind of friends because England want the Protestant Reformation in England because that's good for them. And it's good for them in the mechanisms as well. France and the Ottomans are basically friends because they're the least enemy of anybody else at the table. And then the Pope and the Habsburgs are friends because the Habsburgs are losing all of their territory and the Pope is losing all of their religious power.
Yeah.
So you make your friends where you can. So
they're all pining for the old days.
But yeah, it's really hard to find good multiplayer war games because of the diplomacy thing. And so when they do show up, they become enormous type of stuff. But yeah, so Great Battles of History, Hoplite.
Yes.
That's I don't think that's too expensive. And then Here I Stand, which just came out with their 500th anniversary edition. Because it's 1517.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
It took me a moment. I've had a little bit of whiskey, so it took me a moment there. But yes, excellent. Well played.
And so if you know Great Battles of History, there's 20 games, 10, 15 games that you can play there that are all using the same system. And if you know card-driven games, which is what Here I Stand is, there's another 20, 30, 40 games that you can play there.
Yeah.
And then you get the weird games.
Oh.
By the weird designers with the weird mechanisms that just don't show up ever. Designer, yeah, go ahead.
I'm a sucker for those.
I mean, it's hard because this designer, Rachel Simmons, came up with a game about Napoleonics, and she said, I really want it to look like what you think of when you think of those old wars.
Right.
And you think of them pushing around these sticks on a big map of the battlefield. And you think of, you don't think of dice. You don't think of little cardboard chits. And so she made a game called, first she made, the first one I can't remember, but the second one is Napoleon's Triumph. And then she made a third one called Guns of Gettysburg. I have Guns of Gettysburg here, which is beautiful, but let me show you the map type of thing.
Oh, yes.
So that's a straight image of play. The blocks and the map is this area map, and you move right up to the edge of it.
Show that map again, and
Yeah.
I will keep my mouth shut, so you say something.
Yeah, so all of these blocks are your units. And like Stratego, you can see what they are and your opponent can't. And then the attack is, I'm going to charge across this field, and hopefully it's not going to go poorly for me. And there's no dice. It's entirely what do you have available to fight me right now.
Nice.
And that stuff gets revealed, and then it goes poorly for me because life is bad. Yeah, 75 sounds about right.
Yeah.
GMT's going to have a sale in any minute now, though. One of the great things about the wargaming community is that it's really small compared to the role-playing game community, at least as far as I can tell.
Right.
And so, I'm going to go down to GMT's convention in October, and there's going to be 150 people there, and it's held in their warehouse, and you go talk to Gene because he's a
That's
cool guy.
wonderful.
It's just this very tiny thing. You don't have Gen Con where if you want to get into it, you have to fight with people that are doing D&D, right?
Yeah.
So
that would be the historical conflict simulation that I would most identify with, getting lodging for Gen Con.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully less conflict, but you never know. As generic nerd notes, even 75 does not sound very cheap, unfortunately, because I'm picking up these games on pre-order, which means I get them at 50% off. But one of the bigger problems, as somebody posted to me on Twitter earlier, is that a lot of the games in my collection are out of print because they printed 1,000 copies because that's all that would ever possibly sell.
Yeah.
And then they're all gone. And the ones that were good, the publisher probably doesn't exist anymore because it was some random person who just decided to put something out. Or it was Avalon Hill and they're gone.
Right.
Or it was SPI and they're gone. And all of that stuff's kind of held up in limbo.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's for games in general. I mean, this is probably a thing that plagues many media.
Yeah.
But it's a thing that's really coming to a head with games because in the beginning we weren't archiving. Like, you know, I mean, there were people out there doing it, but it wasn't like there weren't libraries and whatnot. And and now we're getting to the point where there are people putting forth a concerted effort, but like, you know, you there's always hidden gems out there that you'll never find. You know, like that's
it's really kind of a sad deal. I mean, some of the things that I fought really hard to find. You end up with swap meets, and you know, somebody moves and they just have to drop their collection size, and all of their games are from the 70s because that's when they were collecting. And so the swap meets fill up with all these old games. Yeah, and you don't know. It's very difficult to tell outside of like 20 rock stars, you know, which if I saw them, I would immediately pick them up just on principle.
Right.
It's really hard to know what you should be trying to look out for if you wanted to rummage in those bins. And the stuff that people are putting out now, that MMP is putting out, that GMT is putting out, that Victory Point Games is putting out, are so good. I don't believe you need to worry about going out and finding those old games. Like Guns of Gettysburg there, that's Rachel's third game, and her second one, Napoleon's Triumph, I think sells for $300 on eBay. And it's not like that came out very long ago. That's newer than Burning Wheel.
Okay.
Yeah, like, but she made one print run, and that's it. And there's talk of maybe a second print run sometime. But you know,
so like they're doing print runs for this. Like, it's more than a book, then, right? Like, it's you've got chits and pieces that you're pushing around and whatnot.
Yep.
So I mean, like, that's the big thing that's holding it back. Like, because for instance, I have games that I would consider that I've made and put out there that aren't out of print, but I don't do anything. They just, like, every so often somebody sends me $3 and I'm like, oh, I sold another Time and Depth. That's great. And but that couldn't happen with a lot of these games. Is that the case? Or?
So it's possible, and we'll talk about Vassal in a second.
Oh, okay.
Because you could play a bunch of these because of fan work that went into building systems to play them on. Squad Leader was super popular, and so was Advanced. And so people have built systems to play those games specifically.
Right.
But a while back, some open source people decided to build kind of a generic board gaming system. Specifically, they wanted to make it generic, but their primary target kind of was supporting ASL because it's just huge. And so most wargaming companies or their fans will end up putting wargames onto Vassal almost as soon as they come out.
So this is a digital thing that you're talking about here, or is this?
Yeah, it's you can get it for free, VASSAL, and you can get modules, which is something that you can put onto Vassal and then play the game. You can get them for free almost all the time. GMT puts out Vassal modules for all their games for free that includes everything that you need to play the game. And the rule books for the games are on GMT's website for free. So if you wanted, you could play Here I Stand for nothing. Please don't, because I want GMT to survive. But you could, you could play Hoplite if you wanted to check it out. Because these companies know that their hobby, the hobby is so small, and people like collecting even if they're not going to play.
Right.
And I guess Gene has just felt that it was worth it, and that's the model that Wargames have tended towards, is that we really like the physical object because you're so used to these chits, and it's really nice opening it up and you sit on your back porch and read through your rule book with whatever, with your whiskey or your port.
Yes.
Or you set it up on the table and you just push the counters around.
Yeah.
Which is something you'll see a lot. But if you want to play with somebody, because it's really hard sometimes to find somebody local, you'll get the Vassal module, and you have the rule book and they have the rule book because you bought the game.
Right.
And then you just play like this. This is how we play Here I Stand a lot. And this is how I'm going to play Here I Stand with an as yet unnamed group of streamers in the very near future.
Nice.
With video conference, Vassal in the background, and you just talk and you play like it was over a table.
Nice.
It's basically Roll20 for war games.
Yeah. That's exciting. Because I mean, like, I do remember, I guess I lied to you when I said that I didn't do any, because I did have back in the day, I think on a Windows 95 machine, I had a Napoleonic war game that I played. It had to have been, because I remember the little floppy disks that I had to install it with. But like, I didn't know what I was doing, so I played around with it for like maybe a month, and then was like, okay, I can't get anywhere with this. I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing about kind of the computerization of war games. There are kind of two paths that people ended up going down. One of the paths is Campaign for North Africa, which is a game that nobody has ever finished. Not even the designer, none of the playtesters, nobody.
Wow.
The joke is that it simulates how hot your tea is for the individual soldiers of the British Empire. And I'm not entirely sure that's not true.
Right, okay.
It's that kind of game, right?
Yeah.
And so games, and they were like, let's just simulate everything.
Yeah.
Because it will be better if we simulate everything, right? Yeah. This discussion all over the role-playing game community too, right? Yeah. So those ended up going down the path that became computer games. And so there are very complicated computer games that simulate everything. But the group that I associate myself with is the group that really appreciates war games for being able to understand the system that they are working within.
Okay.
And just the fact that you are the person moving the pieces around and you are the person who has to implement the rules, the understanding you get of what the designer thinks happened and why the designer thinks that it happened that way is just a little bit better, you know?
Yeah. So that is a really interesting part to me, because like that is one way in which you can look at role-playing games is to think of it as genre analysis, right? Like to say, I want to talk about horror, and I'm going to use a Jenga tower to do it. Or I want to talk about sword and sorcery, and so I'm going to use 2 dice to do it. Anyway
for hypothetical examples, yes.
Yeah, for some hypothetical examples. And so I can read some games, I can read them and go, for role-playing games, I can read some of them and go, okay, I see what this author had to say about this genre, or sometimes about this particular intellectual property, right? Like if they're doing a licensed game or something like that. And sometimes I can read it and say, oh, this, if I'm being catty, I could say, oh, this author had spent no time thinking about what they're trying to get at here.
Slap a D20 on it, call it good.
Yeah. But in either case, there's interesting analysis to have to be done there. So it's interesting to look at war games not as genre analysis, but like historical event analysis.
Yeah, exactly. And the same kind of reading through and then saying, oh, they put some cards into this game and they just made a card-driven game, and this shouldn't have been a card-driven game.
Right. Right.
They use this mechanism and it doesn't make any sense applied to this conflict.
Right.
But it was an easy mechanism to apply.
It was out there and they just put it because
Mhm.
that was what they're familiar with. That's what they knew how to work with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh God, I love these hobbies. I do so much because there's just this multi-level of interrogation that you could do.
Mhm.
I am one of these people who thinks it's 100% legit to read a role-playing game and be done with it. Like, not like this game's not for me, but like
that is enough.
Yeah. You get value out of reading a role-playing game text. But I will throw on the caveat there that I am also the kind of person who owns PDFs of like, I think just under 1,000 calculator manuals.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that you could read those without owning the calculator and get something out of it. So, that's the grain of salt that this comes with.
But, I mean, there's a piece there. So there's a piece there that is, you can get something and it might be enough, but you have not gotten everything.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's also that too. Like there's the you can apply your own experience to how the game's gonna go from other games like it that you've played.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes you can play. Okay, so I got a wargaming example for this.
Mm-hmm.
Sky Galleons of Mars. We were playing Sky Galleons of Mars. And for those who aren't aware, this is a fictional world where I don't know why I had to preface that with fictional world.
No. Sky Galleons of Mars. That's completely historical.
Yeah, it's completely historical. It's about British imperialism in the late 1800s when they, as we all know, conquered Mars. Absolutely. So they're on Mars. There's a McGovern. No, wait, that's not the word I'm looking for. There's a liftwood, I think is what it was. There's some sort of wood that grows on Mars that allows wooden ships to float. So
unobtainium.
Yes. So you have these giant galleons, these giant ships of wood that sailed on the sky Galleons of Mars. I'm just explaining the title to you.
Yeah, totally.
And the reason why I bring this up is that we'd play these and we'd have these giant galleons and then we would fight and we would be like, yeah, that was fun. And then there was a scenario where the Aphid class ship, which was their ironclad, screw-driven, like the British, like the first time they made like these small ships that are covered in iron, that instead of having a bunch of galley slaves, I assume, running the thing, they had coal, right? It was a coal burning boiler that was running it, and so that allowed them to use these small ships. And we played that scenario, and it comes with I think to emulate these games that you're talking about, it comes with an account of the historical encounter that explains what actually happened and how the Aphid class changed warfare forever. And we played it, and over and over and over again, the Brits with their Aphid, this tiny little Aphid class, kept losing. Every time we did it, we were like, I don't know what's happening. And then one of us, and I don't remember who, although I suspect it was me, but that it's been many years, and one of us realized that because you had this tiny ship and you had a much smaller turn radius, you can stay on the same side of your opponent's ship the whole game. And that was a tactic that was unstoppable. It was just brutal because you could just pound them and pound them and pound them. If they happen to hit some of your guns, you just turn to the other side and you just pound them and pound them. And eventually there's nothing they could do except sink into the red sands below. But it was this sad and glorious moment. Like it was beautiful because we saw what happened and how it changed everything. But we had played like it was as if the designers had like written this story for us and said, this is what will happen to you. And when it did, it was the same thing. It was like nothing will ever be the same again. And I do think we actually retired the game very shortly after that. I often think of it as like a moment of perfect gaming with my home group because of that, like that result that like it felt like cheating, but it was absolutely what they wanted you to do.
Yeah. One of the crazy things about these war games that have enough background for you to apply narrative.
Yeah.
Right. Because I am perfectly fine. Like Sky Galleons of Mars is 1850s, 1860s, Britain, maybe even a little later than that, maybe early 1900s. Britain in naval combat. And because, this is post-Napoleonic, they wanted their own history applied to it so they could do some fun things with it. But because you have enough history, at the end, you have a story to tell.
Yeah.
I can tell you the story of the time that the Pope in Here I Stand went on a rampage and invaded most of Italy and then took a little bit of France to win the game. The War Pope always gets brought up in our games. I can tell you the story of the Martin Luther, whose Reformation went so well that we didn't bother with the rest of the war. Like he won super, super early. Just all of this kind of crazy stuff. But then I can also talk about weird pieces of history. People that play ASL a lot or people that play other, World War II games a ton can talk to you about what's this tank like versus this tank because of the way all of these different designers talked about it. I can talk about the Battle of the Bulge in way too much detail because it's a very common thing for people to simulate. The things that you know about in history, the Battle of Waterloo in Napoleonics, the Battle of Waterloo is a really boring one to simulate because it was a mistake. It should not have gone the way that it actually went. And so people don't simulate that one. They go back and they simulate Austerlitz, which is really hard to simulate well. So game designers do what they can because it was a surprise. And how do you do a surprise? Everybody playing the game knows what happened.
Right. Yeah.
So how do you build your mechanisms so that they still could potentially fall into the trap?
Yeah. Oh, it's a lovely design challenge.
And so people like to do Austerlitz, where Napoleon hid his forces in the fog in one of the cities, and then waited way too long, so the opponent was completely out of position. But then, how do you simulate it? And I haven't found a simulation that does what happened historically, but I don't think it's possible.
Oh, okay. So this is interesting, right? Because this gets into. Okay, so the behemoth in role-playing games is Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Right.
It's the just far and away. It's the recognized as the first, far and away the best-selling one, and right now in this moment in history, it is shockingly popular. Like, largely because of streaming and whatnot. But so here's Dungeons and Dragons. A pastiche of ancient and medieval worlds with a bunch of fantasy stuff thrown in. It's been muddled over the years. It's going to sound like I'm complaining about it, and I am, but not in the way that people think. Or maybe people have guessed where I'm going at here. Because the thing about D&D. And what I was saying before about genre analysis, because you don't need to like use that for role-playing games all the time. But like if you do think of this, D&D, if you look at D&D as genre analysis, one of the things that happened is that it didn't analyze the genre; it invented it. Like it changed functionally changed how that genre worked
Sure.
after D&D came out, and then was followed closely by computerized games that borrowed from it so extensively that it's its own, it's like when a band comes along and just like, Black Sabbath shows up, and then, oh shit, we have heavy metal now. And so wait, where was I going with this?
D&D. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So the thing is, D&D will tell you how much damage a sling does, but Caesar will tell you that he would prefer a sling if he had to fight an elephant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And those two, the dice that D&D give a sling, and what Caesar, who has seen slings slay elephants, says are so at odds, but it just completely broke like the modern understanding of it, right? Like, and I don't think this is a great sin by any stretch or anything like that. But if you spent a moment and thought about somebody hurling a rock from a sling at you, you would be like, "Wait, hold on,
it's a bullet."
Yeah, that shit is nasty. So, is there, like, in wargaming? Does this exist? Are there like cliches that have grown out of very popular war games that have changed how people think about? You know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So Great Battles of History, like I talk about, that is the dominant way that people consider ancient warfare for wargaming now, I believe. The cohesion hit model. Because the designers, and I think, is that Mark Herman too? He does he just does way too much. The idea of these forces just kind of losing momentum and then eventually falling apart. I can't even name any game that I have that uses a hit point model that you would think of like in D&D.
Right.
For example, none of them do something like that. They are all something along the lines of this unit is slowly losing cohesion. Maybe the block games. So there's a couple that have done things that they have gotten popular enough that everybody does them and everybody complains about them. So Napoleonic Warfare.
Yeah.
Historically, Napoleonic Warfare, two sides clash, and each side will do about 1 to 5% of their own force size in casualties to the other side. So that's wounded, missing, lost, dead, whatever. But 1 to 5% is really hard to model because it takes forever. And so one of the big Napoleonic games that came out in the past 20 years called Napoleonic Wars uses this dice pool system, and it says 6s are hits. Well, that's way higher than 1 to 5%.
Yeah, 16 roughly.
And so the battles are just super bloody compared to normal historical Napoleonic battles. But it's such a pain to do it any other way that we're like, whatever. It's fine. It's good enough. And so you play these games of Napoleonic Wars, and these forces just evaporate. Where really it should be just a ton of maneuver, but it can't be because the game would take forever. So that's certainly something. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's one other that comes to me is the idea of opportunity fire, which is kind of D&D's action of opportunity. These guys are running across our field of vision, and so we shoot them. And so in ASL, as you're moving, you move your chit 1 hex at a time, and your opponent gets to choose the moment that they fire.
Right.
And at that moment, they roll the dice, and that's when the range happens and all this kind of stuff. And there's a game called Combat Commander that I have down here because it's another one of my favorite games ever. And Combat Commander says, well, what if they didn't see him? Or what if you just, weren't ready? What if you were in the ditch because you were freaking out. Like, what if all these things? And so Combat Commander says you have to have a card in your hand that says you can fire. So your opponent doesn't know that you can't fire. So they're moving slowly and they're freaking out. But you know that you can't fire. So you're just trying to make them stop before they get to the place.
That's
if they
great.
knew you couldn't. Yeah, so that moment. But there's a bunch of people that complain about both ends systems. There's a new one that somebody's working on called Last 100 Yards that's a really interesting. When you would have fired, you figure out what all the modifiers are and you put a little token down, but you don't roll. And everybody does everything. So you take your whole turn and you keep putting these tokens down. And then at the end of the turn, after all the moves are done, you roll for everything. And you find out those people that you thought made it to the building, none of them made it to the building.
Oh, that's good.
But you couldn't know, like,
it's
basically a way of scripting your actions without being able to script your actions.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
So hopefully that'll push some new, because the systems are changing all the time. So
yeah, that is interesting. There's a role-playing game by Sanguine Games. They do a lot of anthropomorphic stuff, and this one is based on the albedo sort of. It's a sci-fi, anthropomorphic sci-fi military thing.
Nice.
And one of the genius things that game does is it takes this central metaphor that we often use, which is, two people with swords trying to... It's not even that. The central metaphor quite often is two trees with axes trying to hack each other down. Like that's
sure. Yeah. That's pretty close.
And then they're like, well, what happens if one of them moves? Oh, shit. We got to make up rules for that. Well, what happens if you've got a bow and arrow instead of an axe? So this one says, no, the central idea is that you don't want to be shot. And so quite often you're not rolling to hit people. Like if you're a sniper, you might be rolling to hit people, but most of the other time, you're just saying, if you go in here, this is the number you have to beat to cross this area here because, oh yeah.
There's a game called Fields of Fire. So talking about these weird metaphors, everybody uses this dice pool thing. The roll 2d6 and try and hit a target number or get below it is super common. All these kind of things. The games that have remained on my shelves. So you saw that picture. I've easily had 5 times that many war games, but I get rid of things religiously. And the stuff that stays is the stuff that has such a strange metaphor that it's just so compelling.
Right. Yeah.
And some of those games aren't actually very good.
Right.
Because the rest of it is a mess, or the rule book is opaque or whatever.
This is the original concept to Ron Edwards' Fantasy Heartbreaker, which is that there's that little kernel inside it that you're like, whoa, what if the game was just that? Yeah.
So there's a game called Fields of Fire that I have that's a solitaire game. Solitaire games take off in wargaming because it's hard to find a player.
Yeah.
And in Fields of Fire, you are moving into cards because the entire map is made up of cards. You move into a card, and that card says, there is something potentially here. So you roll, and that something might show up. The big trick with Fields of Fire, as the name implies, is that you don't shoot at something. You shoot towards something.
Right.
And so I have my force on this card and I have my force on this card, and they're both shooting at the sniper that's up here. So the sniper up here has 2 Fields of Fire overlapping.
Yeah.
And so the modifier they're going to have to roll against, like in that game, is how can they not get hit, hopefully. Yeah. But that also means that you have things like, well, there's artillery coming down, and then you just revealed a new sniper, and where's the sniper going to point their field of fire at? And where's the artillery field of fire covering all this kind of stuff? So you're manipulating those fields is like the whole game. But then there's a huge subcomponent of the game that's also genius, but is also a mess about communication. You move in there, and then you've lost communication with all of your everybody above you. And what are you supposed to do? Because you have to get orders. You can't do anything without orders. You get like one initiative action point a turn, and you get to use that on one person in your entire group. And so the whole game is like, well, do I cart my telephone wire up or do I shoot a flare? Like there's mechanisms for everything, right?
Oh, that's great.
The fields is such a good thing, and it's just like this. I wonder if they got from the same place.
Could be. I remember a friend of mine way back when I was in high school, or just out of high school, and I had friends going into the military, and a friend of mine, this stuck with me. He had gone to, and it must have been like a boot camp or something like that, and they had an experience talking to experienced soldiers in the field, and talking to one of them that was basically dealing with like, you know, the 50 cal or, you know, like the machine gunner, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And he explained his job as increasing the metal density of the air, which is very grim, but also an interesting look at what that job is, and very different than how you deal with it in video games, right?
Right. Like you don't aim a 50 cal.
Yeah.
You point it in the place where the enemy is generally.
Right.
The suppression thing.
Yeah. And that's the other thing about this Albedo game that I really enjoyed at one point, because whenever you hit things, you do two types of damage, and one of which was physical and the other was psychological.
Yep.
And like things like armored personnel carrier could stop the physical but not the psychological.
Yep.
So, you know, you would have these small arms fire that couldn't penetrate it, but you have a bunch of soldiers sitting inside of it just going nuts because it's just those pings going off of it. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to say that that's a glorious thing in real life.
No.
But this method of this mechanism that they've come up with to simulate that is wonderful. Like
one of the biggest problems in war games is that I am not worried about the fate of cardboard.
Right.
And games that can find a way to make me worried about the fate of my cardboard are the best games. Easy.
Yeah.
But it's a very difficult thing to do. And so a lot of them will tend to make things extremely deadly and make it very difficult for you to get new stuff. But that doesn't play well historically because it wasn't really that deadly. You just were too scared to do anything about it, you know? So it's hard.
That's great. I love the design challenges. And I mean, I assumed that there were design challenges, and I didn't want to, but like, it's good to hear about them.
There's other kind of modern ones that are showing up and covering new periods in new and interesting ways. One that you've probably heard Sage talk about is the coin games.
Yes.
And that entire system came out of a CIA person saying, look, this is how we think about counterinsurgency in real life. They're not, here's the bad guys and here's the good guys. Here's a handful of all factions that all have strong feelings for everything.
Yeah.
And the situation is really, really complicated. And so his entire system is built around how can we make it so that all of these factions are just completely wires crossed for the whole game. And so there's one that's a distant plane about the ongoing-ish war in Afghanistan. And it is one of the hardest games to play, not because it's complicated, because it's a very simple game, but because the US's goal, as the game states it, is to get things stable enough that they can leave. But as soon as you start to leave, the other players, are tearing things apart because they don't want you to win. And just so it's such a hard kind of conflict as soon as you get to these more modern pieces. So then you go back and you play Vietnam, and that's still too modern.
Right.
So they made a counterinsurgency game about Caesar's push into Gallic France. So if you want to play Ancients and you want to play this kind of very normal Eurogamey looking, there's a bunch of cubes on this board. It's Falling Sky is a great kind of little Ancients warfare.
Nice.
So that's modern wargaming. I know that we're pushing time.
Oh yeah, we are. I do have a question though.
Yeah. I mean, I sleep here. I'll be here all night.
Yeah. For reasons, I have been reading about medieval England, in particular, outlawry in medieval England.
I mean, I can't imagine why, except that I want that game, so it needs to come out soon.
And in one book that I was reading called Summer of Blood, which is a good book, I recommend it. It's about I'm going to mess up the date. I'm so bad with dates. It's in the 1300s, though, I believe.
Give me a historical event, and maybe I can help you out.
This is a failed rebellion. This is... is
it the English Civil War, or
no? This is Watt Tyler and or Tyler Watt, or oh my God, this is the moment where live on YouTube I
tried to do as many of my pieces of research beforehand. I think that's late 1300s.
Yeah.
The Peasants' Revolt, is that what that is?
Yes, the Peasants' Revolt. Yes, and it is a truly compelling read.
Sure.
And it's interesting in many ways because it's one of those moments in history when a group of people just suddenly they're like it's a group of people are possessed by the Twisted Sister classic "We're Not Going to Take It."
That's right.
And suddenly realize, wait a minute, that's all we had to do. And now these people are afraid of us and we can burn their houses. And, oh, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't burn everything. What's going on? And it's great. So I'm wondering, is there a game out there that I can experience this? Or do I have to design it? Because I will. But
so there exist games about things like that.
Right.
Whether they will do what you want is the harder question, right? So Coin Games, there is a game that just came out by my favorite counterinsurgency designer, Brian Train, about the French-Algerian War. Because the Algerians said, hey, we're not going to be French because we're Algerian. And the French were like, no, we're going to make you stay French. And that's just a nice little 2-player or single-player game. And if you play the Algerians, that's very much no, we're just not going to take it anymore.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of games about the American Revolution, which is, kind of our version of that entire thing, including one whose title escapes me. It's over on my bookshelf somewhere. That's a solitaire game where you are playing the British trying to deal with these upstart colonies. And it is extremely good. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I think one of the things that really kind of I find compelling about this is that there's a few people involved in it on the peasant side who there's the I'm really, really bad with names. I think it is Watt Tyler, who is he was a veteran of, so he wasn't part of the noble class who were born to fight or anything like that, but he had been in many wars and whatever. So he knew the importance of discipline, like we were talking about far earlier in this discussion.
Absolutely.
And he managed to kind of control him that way. And then there was a preacher whose name is eluding me. Oh my God.
You could just make it up. I wouldn't know.
No, but like people, be somebody who knows. This is like he's an incredibly important figure in all this, but who like is a rabble rouser and getting and so you had these two forces that weren't at odds. They worked well together. One who was able to like really charge people up, and the other one who was able to take that energy and focus it and make them do things. And it but it's also a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing, and then it gets like that's where it all starts. And specifically, like, not just the peasants, like the king, I think, is 14 years old or something like that. And his group of advisors are a bunch of old men who are like holding on to their power. And then his slightly older friends, his teenage friends who are like, so just imagining how terrifying all of that was for him. Yeah. And the way that they weren't revolting against the king, they were revolting against everyone around the king. So they were like, "You're totally our king. We love you." He's like, "Wait, they love me," and all the people around him were like, "But they're going to kill us. They're going to."
Yes.
Oh, it's such a wonderful situation.
The closest. So I don't have anything in that historical period. So one of the things that I do is my shelves are organized, or I try to keep them organized from oldest time period on the bottom to newest time period on the top.
Nice.
And I try to find historical periods that are weird and hard to cover.
Right.
And so I had an English Civil War game for a little while, but that's a little too late for this.
Yeah.
But I don't have a Peasants' War game. But a similar historical situation is the Gauls against Caesar in that game I was just talking about. They're all basically on the same side, except for the Aedui, who, whatever, we can ignore them safely. And Vercingetorix is trying to pump all the Gauls up to be able to deal with this kind of thing, but they're not all together, And so they're just trying to figure out how they can fight this Caesar and his legions streaming in from Rome successfully without just getting completely destroyed. But the idea of a game where either all the players are playing on the same side in the rebellion, pushing through, or a game where one player or two players are playing the rebellion and the other player is the king. I mean, there's a game called Churchill about the three allies trying to divvy up what happens after the war, but they're also fighting the war at the same time. So you don't want to fight the war too hard because you've got better things to do. And there's a game called Pericles about the two rival politicians in Sparta and the two rival politicians in Athens just fighting for the glory of who actually gets the win. Lots of games where you can have multiple people on the same side, but not exactly wanting the same thing.
Yeah. Oh, that's
Absolutely.
great. Wonderful.
Too many games.
Too many games. That is the problem in life in general. Well, okay. So I think at this point, then I will, on the too many games note, that is perfect. I'll thank you very much. I have learned quite a bit about war games. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I, going into this, wanted to make sure I asked you, but don't. Well, I'll hit you up on Twitter if that doesn't happen.
Yes.
Where can people find you? That's a question.
Excellent segue. You can hit me up on Twitter at HackerBlinks about any wargaming / music composition / programming / role-playing gaming questions that you might have. I have at least one of each of those currently in progress because I've got my Napoleonic war game that I'm working on. I've got a game of On Guard, which is kind of half Kriegspiel, half role-playing game that I'm trying to work on with Chris Bennett. And yeah, all sorts of crazy things that are happening. And one of these days, I'll get another piece of music out so that people can listen to it.
Excellent. So. Well, thank you. I should mention, if you don't know me, I'm Eppy. I'm Eppidiah on Twitter. All these links will, of course, be in the description, or you can check out my games that appeared in my magazine, Worlds Without Master. They are not historical. Although they are all true events, they have just happened in dimensions stranger than ours, is how I would describe it. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. This is a lot of fun.
Anytime. Yeah, sometime we'll have to do the whiskey episode when I am closer to you.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, we'll have to make it happen at a convention. I am putting together gear so I can do these live and in person too.
Oh,
so
excellent.
we're going to make that happen.
Cool.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you later. Bye.